Amazing Grace, written by John Newton, a slave trader in the 1700s who eventually renounced slavery. There's hope. In April, Barbara and I spent 3 weeks encountering places, people, and history in parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama. We left home with some apprehension about going to places unknown, but we're graced by friendly hospitality. We hoped that we could get a deeper understanding of our history by being where slavery, forced indigenous removal, and the Black freedom movement actually took place. We'll share just a sampling of our experiences facing the past along the way to the Equal Justice Initiative's events in Montgomery.
The Whitney Plantation in Louisiana focused on enslaved people who lived and worked there. We read their names listed with country of origin and price paid. It was painful to see clear evidence of the cruel system that was commonplace when owning people was accepted as a God-given right in our country. Some of the people who had suffered on this plantation before emancipation were interviewed for a 1930s WPA project. Clay statues portrayed them as children. Each visitor tag quotes an elder's remembrance. Stories of resilience, hope, and faith were encouraging, but we believe there's still generational trauma in need of healing.
In Tennessee, we walked a trail worn deep by Native people as they were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands and marched to Oklahoma. The blossoming dogwoods and promise of spring we saw concealed the anguish and death of this historic trail of tears. Realizing people who loved this land were forced away felt unsettling and heartless.
In one place, a mile-long rock wall honored Telane, a Yuchi woman. She took 5 years finding her way back home, walking alone. I felt awe and joy when I heard that Telane returned because the rivers in Oklahoma didn't sing to her. A great-great-grandson spent 30 years building the wall in her memory. We were thankful to see so many signs marking the historic Trail of Tears. At the time, few questioned the morality of President Jackson's Indian Removal Act. Our history may say land was open to white settlement and the demand for slaves to grow cotton expanded. But walking these grounds, we gained a sense of the epic violence involved in removal, slavery, and the growth of our nation.
During the 50 years before the Civil War, 1 million men, women, and children were sold south by traders. Breeding slaves for sale became profitable for the older plantations east of the Appalachians. Families were separated. Many were force-marched up to 1,000 miles. We were appalled by the evil of these legal business practices which our nation has not yet repented. On the Natchez Trace Parkway, we drove along some of the same route used to force Native Americans out of this land and enslave people into this land. Our hearts felt heavy knowing each population had walked these trails of tears.
The overland slave route ended in Natchez, Mississippi, in a detention camp at the edge of town. The place called Forks of the Road was the second largest slave market in the country. We had never heard of this site where thousands of people were sold every year. Now it is a small park with grass, flowers, and a few historical markers. In one spot, a dry puddle of concrete was embedded with chains and iron shackles dug up when the park was established. As we absorbed this horrific image silently, I sensed the importance of unearthing truth in order to heal wounds of the past.
I felt disappointed that our country has not reconciled such serious issues. Stolen land and slavery created tremendous wealth as more cotton was planted by borrowing money to buy more land and more slaves. This is not just a legacy of the South. The capital flowing to northern bankers, land speculators, tool manufacturers, and shippers helped the North industrialize. This cycle of expansion continued until the Civil War. Our country gained wealth, but these practices violated all of our current UU principles of faith.
Yet, there were uplifting stories. Talking to people and exploring museums, we heard how Black people came together to demand freedom from Jim Crow laws in the 1950s and 60s. We were inspired to see places where so many grassroots campaigns began and grew. Local activists enlisted prominent leaders like Martin Luther King to be the choice of change for the media. We were impressed by regular people taking huge risks.
In Jackson, we saw Medgar Evers' home, now a small museum. Evers became the inspired, fearless leader of the Mississippi NAACP. But in 1965, he was assassinated outside his home with his wife and children inside. I worked with his wife, Merle Evers, in the 1990s when she was a commissioner in Los Angeles. I appreciated her gentle fortitude and perseverance in her quest for justice. There had been 2 inconclusive trials early on under the white power structure. Finally, after 30 years, Byron De La Beckwith was convicted and imprisoned for the murder of her husband.
When we arrived in Birmingham, Alabama, we stopped at the park across from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 girls died in the 1963 bombing. We remembered how shocked we'd felt hearing the news. I was 11, Gordon was 19. As we walked the route of their marches, we were moved by the courage of thousands of Black school children who volunteered to march to end segregation. Along with local ministers, they faced attack dogs, water hoses, and arrest in that park and the downtown streets. National news coverage helped change public opinion. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed.
In Selma, we had the opportunity to listen to Joanne Bland describe her traumatic teenage experience crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in the struggle for the right to vote. That grassroots march was brutally beaten back by police on Bloody Sunday. But Martin Luther King came to help, and they were soon able to march from Selma to the Capitol in Montgomery. These events created the political will to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
We went on to Montgomery, steeped in experiences, feelings, and history. Gratefully, we met up with Marjorie, Grace, Willie, and Lisa. The 6 of us joined thousands of people participating in the Equal Justice Initiative's widely publicized events. Bryan Stevenson, head of the Equal Justice Initiative, brings truth out from the past to find ways to heal and move ahead. We are profoundly encouraged by learning how so many average and extraordinary people have persisted in working together to make our nation one of liberty and justice for all. We feel motivated to do our part to make America truly be America.
Good morning. Montgomery, a city of clashing symbols and conflicting ideologies. In that place and throughout the South on the federal holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King, there is a public holiday celebrating Robert E. Lee's Confederacy, which fought to maintain the torture of a people still experiencing generational trauma in today's America. I was excited to find so many UUs and people of goodwill at the Peace and Justice Initiative, participants from points near and far, energized with possibility, gathered in solidarity and with purpose. It felt heady, empowering, heart-healing, and hopeful. In the city itself, we came upon gracious, generous people everywhere. Airport personnel, local businessmen and women, employees at the supermarket, janitors going out of their way to bestow unexpected acts of kindness. Panelists were some of the most woke people in America, a stunning gathering of our nation's scholars exemplifying the truth, a necessary precursor to reconciliation. Al Gore and Catherine Flowers spoke on environmental justice. Ava DuVernay, whose Netflix documentary 13th is familiar to many of you, examined with Anna Devere Smith the crucial and powerful role of entertainment. There was the brilliance of Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, a recent common read of our faith. And what is a common read if not a call for our serious attention? Sherilyn Ifill is a law professor and the president and director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Ifill is a nationally recognized expert on voting rights and judicial selection, issues absolutely crucial to the functional democracy for which we struggle today. It was an honor to be present with Anthony Ray Hinton, author of The Sun Does Shine, held on death row for 30 years, innocent of any crime, maintaining sanity through sheer genius, and now free because of the dedication of Bryan Stevenson and the cadre at the Equal Justice Initiative. Many of you were familiar with Bryan Stevenson before the 60 Minutes piece because he was last year's Ware lecturer at our General Assembly, and his book, Just Mercy, was another UUA common read. Gentle and powerful were civil rights hero and Congressman John Lewis and the Reverend Dr. William Barber, a leader of the Poor People's Campaign, a man whose life's work is very much in harmony with our Unitarian Universalist principles. Events were punctuated by poets, dancers, musicians, civil rights and political luminaries. One could not help but be struck by the alignment of our UU principles with EJI's mission to amplify the national conversation about racial justice in America. I wish there were time this morning to name the other participants and to tell you about the unparalleled heroism of Ida B. Wells, whose life's work is foundational to understanding the path from terror lynching to Charlottesville. There is history everywhere, marked by the Freedom Rides Museum, Dexter Avenue Church, and the King family parsonage, bombed in 1955, an act of terror which impacted my 11-and-a-half-year-old self and set me on a course which informs my life to this day. We saw children, black and white together, listening intently to a presentation at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we visited the Rosa Parks Interactive Museum, designed with such precision. The experience took my breath away and filled me with pride. After walking with intention and reverence among what can best be described as hanging tombstones at the National Museum for Peace and Justice, a memorial to thousands of terror lynching victims. I spent a couple of hours at the Legacy Museum. Slavery did not end. It evolved, because when one system of oppression ended, another system tailored to the times replaced it. Slavery was replaced by convict leasing. This is spelled out in the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States except as punishment for a crime. Jim Crow laws and terror lynchings kept in place a social order which deprived American citizens of basic human rights. And with Jim Crow laws abolished, mass incarceration of men, women, and children today deprives hundreds of thousands of the rights for which people fought and died in the civil rights movement during which I came of age 60 years ago. Some of you will make a pilgrimage to Montgomery or visit eji.org, which is an excellent interactive website, and those actions will better enable us in our responsible search for truth to share a frame of reference as we move together into the work of creating a future where every person experiences equity and compassion in a country where we are determined to see justice prevail. Thank you.
Our subject matter today is difficult and painful. But let's acknowledge with a little humility and reverence that our discomfort is nothing. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice remembers more than 4,000 people who were lynched in the United States. These lynchings were public acts of murder that were tolerated by officials at all levels: police departments, prosecutors, judges, governors, and presidents. Just look the other way. And this barbaric ritual is not ancient history. It's relatively recent and continued taking place during the lifetimes of some of us who are here today. This practice of lynching inflicted deep, traumatic, psychological wounds on family members, witnesses, and the entire African American community. And how could it not do that? Imagine living under a constant threat, present at all times, and regularly carried out, that you or a loved one could be lynched for any justification, with no one to protect you, no recourse, and knowing that the perpetrators would be free and unaccountable. And those wounds and trauma were carried throughout the country as the practice of lynching generated one of the greatest mass migrations in our country, people leaving the South and moving to all corners of the country. The founder of the memorial, Bryan Stevenson, said that acknowledging the truth of racial terrorism is a prerequisite to national reconciliation. I'm not interested in talking about America's history because I want to punish America, he says. I want to liberate America. Reconciliation is a powerful word. An example we might think about is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is a model that's been adopted in many countries. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who chaired the commission, described it as an incubation chamber for national healing, reconciliation, and forgiveness. That sounds to me like a good idea for America. But it's not easy to envision how such a thing could happen. So how will we achieve reconciliation? Well, one thing is certain: we will only get there if we try. If we decide to be agents of reconciliation. And we can only get there with people of all races working together hand in hand. We will only get there when white people acknowledge that the issues we're talking about cannot be relegated to the category of black stuff for black folks to deal with. And we can only get there if we tell the truth. We celebrate progress that has been achieved through struggle, but things are not all better now. There is an unbroken line between slavery, lynching, segregation, and the mass incarceration and racial injustices in the present time. And for anyone who might say, why not let sleeping dogs lie? I would suggest you're not paying attention. Here's an example. On Friday, 2 days ago, United States Senators Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Tim Scott, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, the only African American members of the United States Senate, introduced a bill called the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act of 2018. This bill would make lynching, the willful act of murder by a collection of people assembled with the intention of committing an act of violence upon any person, a federal crime. There have been 200 attempts in American history to make lynching a federal crime. None have ever been adopted. So they're trying again. These senators do not believe the dogs are asleep. And yesterday, I was at the Keep Families Together March in Camarillo, and I encountered a friend named Dominic, and I snapped a photo of him that I want to share with you now. We need to listen, my friends, to millions of people, millions of voices like Dominic. White supremacy is a poison that is sickening and dehumanizing to everyone. The essayist and anti-Ku Klux Klan activist Mab Segrist wrote this: "Sustaining the brutalities of racial oppression requires the soul-destroying anesthesia necessary to the maintenance of power." So, my friends, let us shake off the anesthesia of our souls. Let us be agents of reconciliation. In January of 2017, Louis Dekmar, police chief in LaGrange, Georgia, stepped into the pulpit of an African-American church to apologize to the community for the lynching of a teenage boy named Austin Calloway in 1940. "I sincerely regret and denounce the role our police department played in Austin's lynching, both through our action and our inaction," he told the crowd. "For that, I am profoundly sorry. It should have never happened." A relative of Austin Calloway named Deborah Tatum was present. I speak your name, Austin Calloway, and ask God for forgiveness for the people who did this inhumane thing to you. In that small act, Chief Dekmar and Deborah Tatum were agents of truth and reconciliation. This fellowship, and each of us, can be an agent of reconciliation. Will someone say amen? Amen. Thank you.